Giants to midgets, it began in Atlantis. A new race, an androgynous root race, descended from on high, from the spiritual realms to live on an island continent created especially for them here on earth. They were luminous soul beings who were sons and daughters of God. More thought than physical, so could enter all realms, the earth, water, sky, and the underground. They still had contact with the heavens and had connections with the sun and the planets of the solar system. They were warned not to get attached to this world that they had descended to, planet Earth, that they were not to abandon their celestial links to the divine. But alas, they fell in love with this material world and fell away from the celestial heavens. This is the backstory to the narrative that Edgar Cayce describes for the origins of much of conscious life on Earth. Who is Edgar Cayce? I am sure that many of you have heard of him. He comes up in many discussions and videos, but here's a little brief bio. Edgar Cayce was born on the 18th of March 1877. He died on January the 3rd, 1945, and he was regarded as America's best psychic. Known as the sleep-in prophet, he could put himself into a trance and allow a different entity to take over his being. This entity, or discarnate voice, could speak through Cayce, giving readings on people's lives, medical advice, and more. Cayce slept throughout these sessions. After the entity had left his body and he'd woken up, he remembered nothing of what had been said. Now, Cayce gave hundreds of thousands of readings whilst in this deep trance state, and he later revealed that he was taken to the Akashic Hall of Records where he could read people's lives, their past lives, like he was reading a book. During the years of 1923 to 44, Cayce gave around 2,500 life readings to 1,600 different people, and 700 of those had had incarnations in Atlantis. That's around half the people who came to see Cayce for life readings. Often people came to ask for advice on issues relating to their current life, but sometimes these readings would begin to discuss the subject's lifestyle in a past reincarnation. Many of the people Cayce dealt with were given life readings for their time in Atlantis, and Cayce noticed that many people who had lived in the Atlantean times were being reborn into the 20th century. According to Cayce's readings, humans have been around for a very long time, much longer than our academics like us to believe. According to Cayce, a continent known as Lemuria was over 1 million years ago, and that it too, like Atlantis, had disappeared into myth. The Atlantean period was to follow, which was not until about 200,000 BC, so 50,000 years later than the Lemurian time. How did Cayce describe Atlantis? He said that the land began as one large continent, but the period of the first destruction broke that continent up into 10 islands. To explain these periods and civilizations, Cayce has to go back to the beginning, to the time before humanity dwelt on this world. The origins of humanity and all other conscious life comes from this. We will go back in time to humanity's origins, back to the beginning of this talk and the beings I mentioned at the start, the ones coming down to this earth from on high, those who are known as the sons of God. These luminous soul beings came from the heavens. They were spiritual beings with no particular form, as they were souls and radiated pure light. These luminous soul beings, the sons of God, landed on the continent that we now refer to as Atlantis. They were warned not to get attached to this world when they landed on planet Earth, but as they explored the land and the waters and interacted with the wildlife, when they connected with the vegetative realm, they began to change. They separated from their connection with the divine universal conscience there. Cayce says the fleshy entanglements commingling the divine with the bestial. Their ethereal thought-like forms began to solidify as they connected with the elements. With the elements of the earth. They went from ethereal spirit thought body, and Cayce described them as going from luminous light soul beings to a denser body type. The sons of God, they were going from light body to physical, and they designed their bodies by thought, thinking about bodies that suited them and their then developing forms. So creating their own bodies, well, let's just think about this. How do you design your own body? Were they getting ideas from the animals around them? There were no humans at this time for them to copy that body design, for these are the beings that would become the humans. Can you imagine designing your own body, deciding if you need hands to pick things up? How many fingers do you need? Is a thumb good enough, or just one thumb? Do you need legs to move about? How many legs do you need? Then noticed that animals had 4, so decided to give that a try. Perhaps 2 legs worked better for them and the bodies they had created. One would need to create the organs inside one's body so that one could breathe and digest. To digest, one would need a mouth to feed oneself, and then one would discover that one needs to build a stomach to digest the food. And then what happens to the remains of that? One would need to design a backside, so sphincters and other organs such as lungs to breathe, bladders to wee, and then suddenly they would realise that these bodies are vulnerable. Accidents happen when doing such things as work. These beings made themselves into all shapes and sizes, from harpies to giants, and because of this densifying of their bodies and the distraction of this new world that they had encountered, the physical connection to the divine grew weaker. The souls were originally light bodies, but the longer they stayed on earth, they became more reliant on the earth and her elements, and so their 5 senses merged with the 5 elements of the planet. Their bodies began to solidify, become denser. They became attached to this earth, free to create and do as they please, following their carnal pursuits. Now, souls are androgynous, male and female, but when they came to earth and were discovering all the delights of this planet, the male and female attributes of the soul could separate and create their own bodies. They divided like an amoeba. They sought self-gratification. These soul beings were able to create anything they wanted just through the power of thought. Now that is true magic. They were able to project their thoughts. They could think things into being. I wonder if in the heavens this is what happens all the time. You are up there in heaven, you want a coffee, the best coffee ever, and you just think about it and it appears the perfect cup of coffee. Now down here on earth, these soul beings could still do this, but not being a heavenly realm, it took a bit more power, a bit more thought power. Things thought of did not come out as perfectly as they would in heaven. They were able to project their thoughts still, but as their soul consciousness fell into the shadows and the physical consciousness, and not the heavenly, their creations were rather odd. And these creations they called the things. The things, what a name to call them, but I suppose to these higher soul beings that were from the heavens and used to perfect creatures, they must have been rather disappointed in these creatures that they were making here on earth, and just regarded them as things. Now these many varied creatures, of which we have all sorts, Cayce called it progeneration, and these creatures became servants. They were regarded as slave labourers, and it was said that they had no souls, as only God could give souls. These creatures, created by the thoughts of the being who'd come from above, they were given the name the things. What are these things they were creating? The things, half human, half animal. These are the creatures spoken about in legends, chimeras, unicorns, centaurs and giants. Now this is part of a Q&A from one of Cayce's readings. I think it's reading 364-11. Please give a few details regarding the physiognomy, habits, customs and costumes of the people of Atlantis during the period just before the first destruction. These took on many sizes as to stature, from what that is may be called the midget to the giants, for there were giants in the earth in those days, men as tall as what would be termed today 10 to 12 feet in stature, and in proportion, well proportioned throughout. The ones that became the most useful were those as would be classified, or called in the present, as the ideal stature, that was of both male and female, as those separations had been begun. And the most ideal, as would be called, was Adam, who was in that period when he, Adam, appeared as 5 in 1. And we're thinking here that the 5 in 1 is talking about the 5 senses in one person. So humanity, as we know today, was created as servants for the sons of God. But that stage was not to happen until after much practice of creating these other creatures by thought forms. At first, the sons of God could think things into being using just the mental capabilities, but it was not that easy. These things at first were not fully human in appearance. They were known as grotesques. They had prehensile protrusions or protuberances. In other words, they had tails. Some of the first humanoid figures were gigantic, up to 12 feet tall, animal creature types that were huge and probably what we now regard as the dinosaurs. Cayce, well, this is a reading from Cayce. Some brought about monstrosities, as those of its associations with beasts of various characters, hence those of the Styx, satyr, and the like, those of the sea or mermaids, those of the unicorn, and those are various forms. So all these beings were strange to look at, being hybrids of various races, mainly a mixture of humans and animal hybrids. The sons of Belial regarded them as things, whereas the children of the law of one regarded them as individuals with developing souls and consciousness. Whatever they were, they did the manual work for the Atlanteans. And this is a quote from Cayce. Those entities that were then their producers, as we would term today, or the labourers, the farmers or the artisans, or those who were in positions of what we would call in the present just machines, were those that were projections of the individual activity of the group. And it was over these then, and the relationships they bore to those that were in authority, that the difference arose.